Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast, Accelerating Leadership Development. Is Adaptive Capacity Driven by Behaviors? Sponsored by Harrison Assessments.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tracey Wick. I'm the VP of Business Strategy for Harrison Assessments. Harrison is a cloud-based, job-specific predictive analytics talent platform that is used across the life cycle of an employee. With me, as I hope you can tell, is my esteemed colleague, partner in crime and fun, Pamela Stambaugh, who is founder and CEO of Accountability Cave. She's also a longtime Harrison partner. And today we're going to be talking to you about best practices that both she and I, our passion is leadership development. But before we get started, what I would love is to take a moment. I see lots of people coming in. I know it's always a few minutes here as we get going, but I'd like to take a moment to meet one another. So if you would be so kind, people love to talk about where they're from. So put in the chat your name and give a shout out, hey, hi from Nigeria. It's always fun to see where people come from. And ideally we would be sitting across from one another, and that person with the greatest commute would be getting a prize, but since we can't do that, we're going to approximate that experience. So I hear Plano, Bristol, Virginia, Texas, Louisiana. Okay, hope you guys get some power down there. Seattle, Missouri, the Philippines. Okay, there we go. Burnsville, Minnesota. Isn't that? I just always love that. Just to see. Let's get a couple more here. Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Yep, heading down there myself in a couple weeks. Chattanooga, okay. Tulsa, Philly. Very good. Well, keep it coming, Gary, Indiana. You're in my hometown. I'm in Chicago. Pamela happens to be in San Diego. So today's session has been really designed with all of you in mind, and what we're going to cover, as I said, is leadership development, adaptive capacity, how that plays out in your organization. As you can see, Pamela and I like to have a good time. Today's session, we hope to be not only educational, but we will enjoy being together as we learn about this very important topic. We will have time at the end for Q&A. We also have our formal bios at the end with contact information. We also encourage you to link in with both Pamela and I. What I'd like to say is, along the way, if something that we're saying doesn't make sense or you have some questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A, which I will be monitoring. And with that, Pamela, let's go to the next slide. I'd like to first thank HR.com. This, as I was talking about at the beginning with Pamela, is our 6th session with HR.com. They've been a tremendous partner to us at Harrison, giving us the opportunity to speak on important issues facing you all as HR leaders. And today we're here to talk specifically about how to accelerate leadership development using a concept at Harrison that we call adaptive capacity. Now, adaptive capacity is exactly as it sounds. It's what allows individuals with leadership responsibility to adapt quickly and appropriately. Now, the global pandemic has certainly demonstrated the need for this. Now, you might be thinking, what is that related? How is it related to the state of HR metrics and talent analytics in 2021, which is the virtual event that we're part of right now? While some organizations have considered themselves highly proficient in developing leaders during normal times, when faced with great uncertainty, the proficiency of leadership development requires an entirely different approach. So the reason we wanted to share our experience, and Pamela is an expert on this for many years, is to offer a new way of thinking for you all in how you use metrics and assessments to inform behaviors and design leadership to create what is called agility. Now, the key here is that agility is what I call a table stake, meaning it is no longer a nice to have. You used to hear people talk about it, but it's now a must-have for competing in today's marketplace. Another way of thinking about this is you have to create an agile operating model. And in order to do that, you have to start with your leaders. And for leaders to develop excellence in terms of managing through these transitions, this uncertain environment, they have to manage what we would say are paradoxical behaviors. And if COVID taught us anything, it taught us that successful leaders have to hold two opposing ideas in their heads at once and make good choices. Pamela?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Here's a classic paradoxical choice. And there, by the way, there is a literature review at the end of this. So there's source materials if you want to, if you're like me, you really love the statistics, you can delve into this. But this is a classic, and I'm sure those of you that are responsible for leadership development activities in your firm can speak to this, which is a choice that leaders have to make every day. Do they focus on short term or do they focus on long term? To be successful, they have to do both. And while there's a difficulty balancing both of these business requirements, you have to stay on top of essentially the rapidly changing conditions. And it's in these moments that these, what we would call seemingly paradoxical choices, that our behaviors either create adaptability and allow for continuous development of our own potential as well as business performance, or they lock us into our old ways of thinking or acting a rigid approach that leads to less than effective results. So today's session, I'm going to be setting up the context with the strategic aspect of it, and then Pamela is going to delve into her experience, having led a number of these programs for many years, and give you what we always like to say, something to do different when you go back to your desk. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to you. In order for us to think about the future, we have to start with where we are today. So we're going to explore the current state with all of you with your leadership development efforts. We're going to do a poll. So Mackenzie, I think you can open this up. Here's a poll. What practices are you currently using in your leadership development strategy? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you, I want to hear from you all. I'm going to give you about 60 seconds to fill this out. There's probably more, you know, if you are responsible for leadership development, you're probably doing a myriad of these. Just go ahead and rank them and take a minute to fill out the poll. Okay, here we go. What practices are you currently using in your leadership development strategy?
Nothing got more than 22%. It's pretty spread, isn't it?
Yeah. Developmental and stretch assignments, assessments and feedback. Well, we at a talent analytics firm, we like to see assessments and feedback, right, Pamela? That's one of our favorite things to do. I think it's interesting, only 12% of the group have high potential programs.
Yes.
Mentoring is 22%. Exposure to senior leadership, which I think is interesting now, particularly with COVID, makes it a little bit more challenging remotely. Cross-functional team projects got 12 and action learning got 8%. I would say that mentoring, I've done this poll for close to 15 years now. I've been speaking on this topic for quite some time. And typically mentoring is one that comes at the top, which, so that's not necessarily a surprise. Okay, we can move to the next slide. What's interesting about this poll, as I said, I've done it for a number of years, is I think that this story, the story that we're telling together here as part of this webinar, is the story that I think we see in the marketplace quite a bit of most companies with leadership development. And what I mean by that is most companies, big and small, public or private, do prioritize leadership development. I personally have never met an executive, they may be out there, but I've not had, you know, they've not come across my experience, who say they're not interested in developing their leadership bench. In fact, it's a $366 billion industry, and that was pre-COVID. And what we have seen, even post-COVID, the statistic that I found from the Chief Learning Officer Business Intelligence Board is that 95% of organizations plan to increase or maintain their investment post-COVID in leadership development. If you go to SHRM, it will definitely confirm this. It's usually one of the top. If you think about what SHRM would say, developing next generation leaders, along with what I'd call the knowledge loss, the knowledge management loss, transfer of workers who are retiring, are their key. It keeps people up at night, right? And so the good news for all of us, and people are weighing in on the chat here that they see mentoring some of the same things that we do. So if leadership development is such a top priority, there's a lot of money spent on these issues. What kind of results are we getting? And here I think it tells an even more interesting story. So Pamela, next slide. Now, I have many different sources that I look at to scan the literature about this, but these I think kind of stand out as ones that tell, I think, the biggest stories that we are here to talk about, which is, we're not doing so well if you look at the scorecard. This is kind of a snippet, if you will, of the gap in terms of the money that's being spent versus the results. So 50% of senior leaders believe their talent development efforts don't really build critical skills, organizational capabilities. That's from a recent Harvard Business Review article. Then there's pre and post assessments, usually are personality based or style, leadership style, which is great, but they're not, particularly now with what we're talking about with adaptive capacity, they're not job specific, if you will. This is the one that I think always hurts because I had the title of Center of Expertise Leader for Leadership Development for a very large bank. And only 10% of the annual outlay delivers concrete results. That always hurts, okay, when I would see those statistics. And this one I think is in particular a pain point for all of you. Despite the pandemic and HR being thrust into the spotlight, headcount is not expected to increase for all of you, I would imagine. In fact, in some cases, it's going down. So the leadership development reality is an interesting one if we think about what we spend versus what we see. And I think there's a couple of reasons if we just explore it a little bit. And again, Pamela's going to delve into this more. But I think part of it is how we're thinking about leadership. Right now, in the past, like I said, in a stable, steady state, there's a very different reality that leaders are experiencing versus the classroom environment in which they're being trained. And so focusing on general leadership behaviors is good, but what we really need to start to talk about is what are the behaviors that matter most for your company, and use assessments consistently, both pre and post leadership. Really think about the design differently. And I think that the other part is people don't always remember unless it's contextual. So the more that there is real-time knowledge, real-time coaching and mentoring, which I was happy to see that mentoring was at the top, the more likely the possibility that people will be remembering what they're learning and developing what we're calling this adaptive capacity. Next slide, Pamela. So the impact of these various competing forces is that everyone feels up in the air. You probably do too, as somebody charged with delivering on these results. And I think that the thing that I want to leave people with, not to spend so much time on this one, but it's really that what I find really interesting is that there's been a tendency to think about, in the popular literature about this, that the psychological and the business impact of not developing the leaders with targeted development is isolated, when in fact they're really two sides of the same coin. And so to be effective today, you have to put equal weight and have a strategic viewpoint on both what we're calling the inner and the outer game. And the inner game are the forces, it's our habits, our blind spots, and then of course the external forces are the ones that are out of our control. And so they can't be viewed in isolation or independently, which is the tendency. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Pamela to talk in more specifics about how she put these concepts to use. But you may despair. I know sometimes when I think about my passion and I think about my excitement about something, and then I look at the scoreboard, sometimes I can be a little disillusioned, but don't be, because there is a solution. The solution is to consider what behaviors your team needs to develop The good news about this is you don't have to boil the ocean. You can get very targeted on what is important to you and your organization. And fundamentally, if you take on adaptive capacity, and it's kind of a big word, but it's really quite simple. It really just means leaders need to know who they are, what their strengths, where their weaknesses, where they may have blind spots, but most importantly, where they developed what I would call compensating strategies that they've used to compensate for something, and we saw a lot of this, and there's some really great research by McKinsey on this, of adapting to a crisis. People really reach for a particular strength that they have until it no longer is a strength. So in order to develop a proficiency, you really need to be able to recognize some of those paradoxical choices, like the short-term, long-term, and start to expand the repertoire of your leaders to be able to make those good choices in the moment. Now, before I turn to Pamela, I have a quote. And I love this quote because there's perhaps no greater sage on modern management and leadership theory than Warren Bennis. And I think it summarizes exactly the challenge that we are all living. And I'm going to see a Q&A here. There's a question coming in. Life on this turbulent, complex planet is no longer linear and sequential, one thing logically leading to another. It is spontaneous, contrary, unexpected, and ambiguous. Things do not happen according to plan. Is that not the truth? And they are not reducible to tidy models. We persist in grasping at neat, simple answers when we should be questioning everything. Okay, let me see. Here's a question. Apart from salary costs, so many companies are offering voluntary retirement, but with it goes knowledge that really can be transferred. Some of these older workers are great mentors required for leadership. How can we tell top management this? Well, that is a really great question. I think that I would come back to answering it this way, which is there's contextual knowledge within every organization. What I mean by that is what is it that makes for success in that company? What are the skills? What are the behaviors? And it's invisible until the person leaves. And so I think that as we unpack this adaptive capacity component to think about what are those specifics for your organization, I think that that is a concept, and that's the whole point of why Pamela and I are doing this webinar today, that you can take that back to your management team and to really help them understand why it's important to think about this before that individual leaves. Great question. All right, with that, I'm going to introduce Pamela. Take it away.
Thank you, Tracey. So what Tracey was pointing to all along the way is the choices that leaders face, whether it's short-term, long-term, or whether it's other choices that are being made all the time with scarce resources, right? So one of the things that we are going to speak directly at that Tracey mentioned is the two major forces that are at play for leaders, and they're often paradoxical, right? Have you noticed that word comes up quite a bit? So what is a paradox? Well, let me flush that out for you a bit here. It's both and with tension. And the tension part is important. It's seemingly contradictory choices that both are true and they aren't going anywhere, and you need to optimize them or use them both. Also could be called a dialectic tension, is referred to that way by some of the articles. What's that? Well, that's the notion that two opposing ideas can be true at the same time. That's really what a paradox is, a both and. I mean, if you're a parent, you know about tough love, yes? Even if you're not a parent, you know about tough love. Where, right? If tough is one way of being, and you do too much of that with a child, you got one kind of problem. And if love is the other side of that, and you give too much of that, you got another different kind of problem. People won't sit next to you in a restaurant, is what I like to say. And on the tough side, if you got too much of that, you're raising a character we wouldn't want in society. Yeah. So it's the both and that is important, and the tension of being a parent is very instructive. Now, I don't happen to be one, but it doesn't matter. I understand that, like I understand, the ground I stand on. Another example is sometimes less is more. So when we talk about paradox, I want to point to a quote by Pullman. He said, the difference between average and outstanding firms is an and mentality. We must find and create tensions. There it is again, right? Force people into thinking differently, a different space for thinking. Thinking goes on up here. I've heard it said it's an ugly neighborhood. Don't go there alone. Only problem is you don't have anybody to take with you. This is not, he said, he didn't say that, I did, but he said, this is not just a performance issue, but a survival issue, because managing paradox helps foster creativity and high performance. Now, who doesn't want that? So, but here's the deal. I'm not going to tell you the amazing results that Paul produced until near the end of my presentation. You have a lot of reasons to stick around, and that would be one of them. So now, as Tracey was saying, we have two major forces, and they're always at play, aren't they? They're the internal forces, the inner game. That's the habits, the thinking that goes on in that ugly neighborhood, right? And they're ours to control if, but it's a really big if. We aren't blind to our imbalances, because we can be, and quite often we are. As a matter of fact, I've rarely, in the 3,500 conversations I've had around the Harrison paradoxes, I have never personally seen anyone who doesn't have at least one. Right? So now the external forces are those beyond our direct control, and I underline direct for a reason. So let's just start with the internal forces. Now, we keep mentioning context, and that's important because it's the background. It's what's going on in the background that may not be distinguished, and yet it's running the show. Now, if you have a teenager and you're a parent, talk to the hand. Well, good luck getting through, yeah? And that's the context. If you're speaking into a context that's not listening, forget it. So that's context. The context is decisive. Now I'm going to spend some time here talking about this particular paradoxical leadership imbalance that you see here, just to get you grounded in what do we mean when we say paradoxical imbalance. So this is a paradox called driving, which really speaks to driving results through people. And how else do you drive them, really? And so the paradox itself is how you manage rapport and empathy when managing the performance of others. You're not directly doing the work, you're expecting others to do the work. And then there's a definition, which is always important. Enforcing over here on the vertical axis is the tendency to insist upon necessary rules being followed. And then warmth and empathy down here on the horizontal axis is the tendency to express positive feelings and affinity towards others. And so now we are looking at permissive over here is where our sample guy, Andrew, is. Permissive is too much warmth and empathy and not enough enforcing, right? So only a person with a kind heart can administer discipline that is beneficial to others. That's one way to say the both and, isn't it? And the both and would be up here in the different colored box called compassionate enforcing. I'm going to grab a little water here. So now, when you look at the comparison of those and you see this person down here with a 3 on enforcing and a 10 on expression of warmth and empathy, that's the operative word there. Yeah. When you see someone who's permissive, what do you think that means? Well, I'm going to answer for you. It means that they're expecting the relationship, their niceness, their friendliness, their warmth and empathy to get the job done, right? And they don't really want, because this is preferences and tendencies we're looking at here, they don't really want to have to insist upon the necessary rules being followed. So they might be oblique in their communication. They might go like this, like, where are you? It's time to come in the room. But they don't say, hey, get back here, right? So that's where you see them as the principal location that they're operating from right now. And then up here in the top left is this red hurricane you can hardly miss. It's like your eye went there first, didn't it? It's like, what's that? Right? Well, that's what happens when that niceness isn't working. And that manager's manager comes and says, where are the results? And then they have to say, right? And then they get mad. So what it actually says when you look at what's happening in that paradox is it's saying the red circle in the upper left indicates that under stress, your behavior may flip and you may react harshly if someone tries to take advantage of your leniency, right? So that's what that is. So driving is one of 12 paradoxes, right? That's measured by the Harrison assessment. And I like to point at this one because if you're in HR, I bet there's a lot of times when you are dealing with managers where an individual comes in and says, my manager this, my manager that. Because at the end of the day, it's really a lot is dependent upon how effective is that relationship with a manager. People leave people. They don't leave organizations. So it's all about that manager and how effective that manager is at being a leader, which is a distinction we're going to make here, right? So now, when someone is down here in the permissive quadrant, let's imagine that they have some fellow manager who's really strongly disciplinarian oriented, right? And they really hold people accountable for the rules and regulation, but they're not very nice. What do you think is their relationship, right? If they're on a team, a leadership team, how do you think they relate to one another? Well, they either demonize or trivialize that opposite way of being, even though under stress, that's where they end up. So isn't that kind of weird? That's a little paradoxical, yeah? And if you look at that enforcing person who's harsh, well, they've got a fear of loss of something that they're trying to protect. And that is not a moment in time. That's kind of all the time. Right. So there's something going on in the background. And this is the distinguishing of that. You know, so the flip-flop of going on, wouldn't it be nice if we as human beings just really recognized, oh my gosh, I'm being permissive. I should be compassionate enforcing. Wouldn't that be great? But unfortunately, that's not how human beings are wired. No, they flip to the opposite behavior and get mad. That's what we do. That's the natural amygdala hijack reaction, is to go get mad. And that's what you see here. And then make somebody else wrong because they're mad all the time, right? So there are 12 paradoxical pairs of traits that are measured by the Harrison assessment. And I do have to say that I have been around long enough, 22 years, but who's counting, that I have had a few of these conversations in my day. And one of the examples that I can give that's personal is I have an emerging leader accelerator. And I use the Harrison assessment to pre-test when they come into the accelerator. Then they spend 6 months developing themselves. And then I post-test to show the intentional leadership growth. And that's what's available. That's what we're talking about here. If you've got 12 looks, 4-color evaluation of how people are wired contextually, and that is decisive, that would be good to know. So that's how I do it. At least in that realm. Now, when it comes to the inner forces, those are not hardcore. Those are not as measurable, although we're measuring them with the paradoxes. Mostly people say, well, soft skills can't be measured. Well, the senior editor at large at LinkedIn in December 2018 said this. She said, and it was a prediction, one of many. She said, creativity and so-called soft skills are becoming all the more important because that's what we can't automate. And LinkedIn data shows that the fastest growing skills gaps are related to soft skills. Now, Ben has pointed to it, Tracey pointed to it, soft skills require more courage. And I borrowed this from Dan Rockwell's blog, Leadership Freak, which I really enjoy. So that's kind of a look at some of the inner forces. At least we're starting to look at the inner forces. Now, here's another look. Mastering Leadership, Robert Anderson and William Adams said a breakthrough in the inner game can result in sudden shifts of the outer game, which in turn can result in big performance gains. But what's in the way? Well, the inner game is letting them down because most of the inner game goes on under the surface and they may not know they're stuck. And that's the context we're speaking to which we're often blind, because those are the blind spots. We don't realize we're expecting relationship to carry the day when some enforcement, what, by, when, and the consequences are really what's required here, so that people have clarity. And if you provide clarity about those expectations, they can actually meet them. So, and that's context, and the context is decisive. Are you beginning to see that with me? Good. So I'm taking that as a yes. So now we're going to look at the external forces, and one person might not be able to directly control what's going on outside. Right? Here's a perfect example. So the first climate change, PG&E. Now I'm in California, so I had a up close and personal experience with this drama. Maybe the first bankruptcy for climate change, but probably not the last. That's the kind of external forces we're talking about here. What you can't do something directly about can feel like the hammer coming down on your head. And with regard to that, the rate of change brings us to choices for which our education has not prepared us. So I'm going to relate to a particular video that I'll give you access to the link for, because even though it was in 2007, it's very definitive. That was a period of time when a lot of change was happening, besides the fact that I got married that year. And that's a side point. So James Munyika is the chairman and director of McKinsey Global Institute and senior partner of the Bay Area of California, which he leads research on global economic and technology trends, right? You know McKinsey, you can't read and not know about McKinsey. As a source of information. And then Thomas Friedman, you know also, if you read, he wrote The World is Flat. He's also a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner with a weekly column in the New York Times. He's written extensively, lots of books, some of those here. And he is the one who was being interviewed by James. And they were having this intense conversation. The world's gone from flat to fast to deep. So if you want to get that, you can take a screenshot here, or you can come back and pick it up later. But that is the link to that interview. It was really amazing. And some of those changes, some of those external forces are user-friendly. Some are harder pills to swallow. So now, in 2007, that definitive year, complexity became fast, virtually free, easy for you, and invisible. What happened in 2007 was a leap from flat. It was kicked off with the iPhone, the cloud, the big data, the beginnings of artificial intelligence. And what Thomas Friedman said is that those technologies abstract complexity away. Well, at least they hide it. On your iPhone, you can now get the taxi, pay the taxi, rate the taxi, and the taxi driver can rate you. And we're now in the middle of flat to fast to deep, all with no touch. Hey, Siri. So in that same conversation, many things were said. But 2 I thought were really, or what I shared with you just then, and then this. The College Board asked themselves, if everyone needed 2 things, what would they be? Now, I wish they'd asked that about 30 or 40 years ago, but they didn't. But their answer was the kids master 2 codes, the computer and the US Constitution. Okay, so external forces. And again, we're just saying some of these are paradoxical. Now, fast forward to 2021 in June, a couple months ago, and Thomas Friedman, once again, I happen onto these things. It's amazing how I find, but he wrote an article in Albany Times Union, and it was played in many other places. The title of which was Democracy or Security, a Hard Choice. And here's what he said. Like everyone else, I look forward to a summer of reconnecting with family and friends and relishing a good old 4th of July barbecue unmasked. But I will be doing so with a pit in my stomach because just beneath the surface calm in America, volcanic forces are gathering that could blow the lid off of our democracy. We're living in a fool's paradise. Enjoy it while it lasts. Now, I'm going to come back to that point. But before I do that, I want to make another something available to you in the realm of solutions about what's going on in the world today. We have an opposable thumb and finger, and it enables us to thread a needle. It enables us to put a catheter. It enables us to do an awful lot of things that no other animal in the animal kingdom can do. That and our language, our uniquenesses of being human. And we also have the capacity to build that same capability with the opposable mind. And Roger Martin, in an article or in a Harvard Business Review article, How Successful Leaders Think, he pointed to successful leaders were able to hold in their heads two opposing ideas at one time. And he did research. There were 50 different people. And in that article, he said, speaking of 50 successful leaders who did this, they welcome complexity and messy problems. Is that you and me? Without panicking or settling for one alternative or the other, they creatively resolve the tension by generating a new one that contains the elements of the other, but is superior to both. And he says, this is a skill you can hone, just like being able to use your opposable thumb and opposable finger. You can develop this. And that's what's available here, okay, is the ability to do that. Now, what we do is we don't really know what to do with fundamentally opposing models. Our first impulse is to determine which is right, and by the process of elimination, which is wrong. And that's the way it is. And we hold that. And in the Harvard, but you can tell I like the Harvard Business Review, can't you? You're seeing it. Innovative cultures embrace paradox. This was the cover. The hard truth about innovation, it's one part creativity and one part discipline. And in it, it says, unless the tensions created by paradox are carefully managed, attempts to create an innovative culture will fail.
I was going to say, between Pamela and I, we're like, when I was in grad school, people used to call me and ask me for theories and books. So if you, I want to just say to anyone on the call, if you want to know a source document, just link in with me or Pamela, and between the two of us, we got it covered.
Yeah, Tracey put hers at the end. Mine are all the way through here. Yeah. So that is the hard truth about innovation, but people don't deal with it that way. So here are two of the paradoxes in this particular article. A tolerance for failure requires an intolerance for competency. Feel the tension of that? Whoa, wait, what? A willingness to experiment requires rigorous discipline. Whoa, wait, what? I'm supposed to be, freewheeling and get all this experiment. No, you need a rigorous discipline to get that to happen well. So I want to tell you a little story about a company. You may know it. It was made pretty famous here recently. But in the early 1990s, it was a $1 million company. And they were, Bob Young was the CEO, and he was eccentric among eccentrics. He was known for wearing a red hat and red socks, just to go with that name. I'm not sure which came first, the hat and the socks or the name. Nonetheless, it was low profit margins plus upgrades. And they were committed to the open source of Linux code, right? That was a a mission, a value. It was like, no, don't take that away. And their very profitable competition, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, were not selling open source anything. They locked that source code. And that created the need for customers to buy from them. Bob said in the article, again, this is coming from How Successful Leaders Think. He said, and it's like buying a truck with the hood sealed closed, right? So they were making a lot of money, but they were also creating dependence. And this irked him. So he said, there's got to be a way to hold that tension and make something happen here. And he did. He held that tension long enough to come up with a both and. He created a corporate market for the Linux operating system, and he did it in a way that made service central. Well, let's just look at how that went. Yeah, the both and paradox strategy paid off in 1999 when they went public the first time. Oh, and then in 2018 sold to IBM for $33 billion. Was it worth it to hold the tension of those paradoxes? Now let's come back to Paul Pullman. Remember, I said it's not just a performance issue that he was saying, it was a survival issue, because managing paradox helps foster creativity and high performance. Let's see what the results were. How about a 290% total shareholder return over those 10 years? Is that a pretty good story? Right now, by the way, I was looking for my copy of it because I was thumbing through the Harvard Business Review as I do every time it comes out. And lo and behold, he was there. He's got a book out. He's now a consultant and he's working with companies. And the whole idea is the world better for your company being in existence today? And that's what he's working on. And he's got a book with a co-author. Grab that most recent issue of Harvard Business Review or just download the article it was amazing. All right, so we're actually suggesting that you could potentially command those two major forces, the internal and the external, or at least where possible, have access to that. And obviously that's going to come with embracing paradoxes wherever possible. Do you remember there are blind spots about that? If you have a blind spot, you're operating like your truth is the truth and not necessarily so. You just don't know what your blind spot is. And that is tantamount to being leader. Now, I distinguish manager from leader. A manager is somebody who has a title that comes with authority to tell people what to do and to expect results. And a leader earns their title by how they show up. Okay, what's at stake here? Oh, let's see. Trust, engagement, productivity, team performance, mutual respect, right? Just a few things. So now I said that I was going to come back to that point, right? So I want to just remind you what was said there is that we're living in a fool's paradise, enjoy it while it lasts. And that is one of our challenges, is that there's an awful lot going on. I'm going to call it an American paradox reality check, okay? So going back to the model of a paradox and staying with the theme, some forces are paradoxical. What he said was security or democracy. And what we're dealing with is extreme views. Now, you may remember that the space in the top right is the balanced versatility place, the place where you're not reacted, the place from which you're not reacting. It's the both and place. It's the balanced versatility. It's the capability to handle the extremes and not get triggered, not get hooked. So a moderate position might be attractive. And I don't know what country you're in, but I bet you got some version of this playing out too, because paradoxes are everywhere. They're forces and they're happening. They're happening right now. So we in the United States remember Abraham Lincoln. He had a quote, "If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand." And that actually was a quote from way earlier, the Gospel of St. Mark, and Abraham Lincoln just borrowed it. Nonetheless, when you think about the decision-making that's going on, the extremes, we have some of that going on, don't we? We have demonizing or trivializing all over the place. That's forces, and they're paradoxical. And we're oftentimes caught making our decision with less than full information and then getting stuck in our view as if it's the truth. And I'm not saying it isn't. I'm not taking a stand. I'm just saying for this conversation, for this element in the room, the view is fundamental. Now, this is, you may know this one because it's an old idiom, the blind man and the elephant. It's the story of the blind man and an elephant, and it comes from India. It's about a range of truths and mistakes. It's also about the need for communication and the need for respect for different perspectives. The idiom shows the effect of observation and bias, right? Now, so what you can see is everybody who's blind is looking at just one aspect and saying, well, that's what an elephant is. It's a wall, it's a rope, it's a tree, it's a snake, it's a spear, it's a fan. Everybody's got a version of the truth. And when you get the whole thing and you get the whole story of it, it's like 8 or 9 little paragraphs. That it was 6 men of Indostan to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. And then it goes all the way through the story. And at the end, it says, so oft in theological wars, the disputants, I ween, rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant not one of them has seen. So that's the elephant in the room. And what we're dealing with here is a lot of extremism. Now, I don't think it's any surprise to anybody here that we don't have a media that's impartial anymore. We don't have a lot of things that are impartial anymore. But in the day when we all read the same newspaper and saw the same TV, we could have heated debates, and we all came to a more informed opinion. And today's media is not impartial, and indoctrination is controlling the messaging. And so we end up not sure where people stand and afraid and polarized. And from here, nothing good comes. Reactions and make wrong are the fodder of the day.
Pamela, we actually have a question that I think goes right with this.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
It says, how would someone balance between the internal and external forces in order to emerge better and stronger within an organization? So thanks for that question.
Well, I would say that that's kind of where we're going. Thank you for the question, right? So the internal forces have to do with knowing yourself well enough. And the external forces I'm going to talk about right here from this model, because this is what's been waking me up at 3 o'clock in the morning, is more of the content that you're seeing here is just, oh my gosh, and then there's that, and then there's that. So perfect question. You're right on spot. All right. So stay tuned. All right. So we've got Facebook and we have Google, which are not objective sources of information. And what used to be softballs and snowballs are now rocks. And the political agenda proponents have to be right. So, to your point, American politic trends are either or, not both and. And that's the opposite, frankly, of strategic agility or adaptive capacity, which is where we want to end up, isn't it? It's rigidity. It's rigidity, right? So it's not a willow bending in the wind. It's a stick, and it stays right where it was put until somebody budges it. Good luck, right? So what you have to do to get ready for that conversation is you have to get familiar with everybody's position. So we've got CNN politics here and their view. We've got Epoch Times and their view. This is Education Union to target those opposing critical race theory. We've got the Federalist, which is a foreign version of what's happening in the United States. And oh my gosh, right? And then there are some solutions presented here for if you're just like this about the winds of those impacts, then you've got someplace you can go for some thoughts about that. And then NPR, you've got a lot of sources, but these are sources that are not controlled by Facebook or Google. So you have to go search out the other opinion and get informed. This is the guy who's the son of the Taliban killed him a long time ago. And now he is the one potential resource in Afghanistan, who might be able to do something and is queuing up to be able to do something here. Right. So my point is not that I agree with or align with any of that, but my point is that in order to access both sides of a convoluted narrative with unfamiliar agendas, you must subscribe to both news points of view to be informed so that you can hold balance in a conversation. Because if you're shocked by what comes out of somebody's mouth, now you're reacted and you're liable to flip like we saw in the driving. You're liable to go, what? And then, of course, you've now just made them wrong. And we know where that goes, right? So I'm suggesting here that we turn that paradoxical traits on its edge and use this perspective from which to make some decisions happen. Can you see this? That instead of good, bad, right, wrong, win, lose, which is what I talk about when I talk about the paradoxes, I say there's no good or bad, right or wrong here. There's just the element of our humanity showing up. We are all humans. And when we look at our team and we see, oh my gosh, we're in deep doo-doo. Okay, so that's what's going on here. The both and has a place from which to come. The both and of leadership gives you strategic agility and adaptive capacity. And a leader best serves from this balanced versatility. Rather than react, a leader responds. All right. So how do you know? I'm almost to the end. How do you know what to focus on for strategic agility, learning objectives, and for whom? Well, you need data analytics. And let's just look at emerging leader, because I do this quite a bit in my current capacity. I can see all of the emerging leaders. You can see that there are 119 people in this data pool. So you could look at everybody, and you can see there's an overview, an organizational emerging leader overview. These are behavioral competencies. And then within that, there are 10 behavioral competencies that make up the emerging leader overview. So strategic thinking here, only 2 people of these 119 are in the red as an overview. But when you look at the granularity of strategic thinking, 22 here are out of balance. So you can actually look at who those 22 are. You have individual data, and you know exactly what their scores are, and you can dive into that data. You can run reports. That's all available to you. How do you know what to focus on? Well, it has to be individually driven. We all aren't motivated by the same things. We all aren't that. So just by way of on the way to wrap up, commanding those 2 major forces powers followership. Now you have managers who become confident, effective leaders. They improve productivity for themselves and through their team. They increase capacity to take on more responsibility, and they have impressive and measurable team results. That's what you can look forward to. Is adaptive capacity driven by behaviors? You bet. Can they be learned? Absolutely. All right. Any more questions there, Tracey?
Yeah, a couple of people have said thanks, high five to us. They had to drop off, so I high five them back. Thank you all. But we do have a couple questions.
All right.
So here's one I think is really interesting. Is adaptive capacity universal, or is it specific to your organization? And I think both you and I have something to say about this, but why don't you start, Pamela?
Well, so adaptive capacity is a capability. And so you have to own your own adaptive capacity. You have to be willing to be with, right? The capacity to adapt is to not have to be right, to not make others wrong, right? And that's where the paradoxes can peel back on those hidden blind spots.
Yep. And I would say, just add to what Pamela said, in addition to that, again, I'm going to take the strategic view in terms of how you look at it. I think that there are core paradoxes that we all are running into every day. Pamela talked about some of them. And particularly from a leadership point of view, it's kind of the air we're all breathing. And what I would say the importance of this conversation is that it's important to focus on what are the most important things for your organization and kind of prioritize that inner outer game, because otherwise, I think we saw with COVID, it's just a soup we're all swimming in, going nowhere, because things are just coming at us too fast. And to her point, instead of responding, we're reacting. So I think that there's these core universal paradoxes of leadership, but there are some that are more important to your organization based on where you are in your business cycle.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a couple more. Here's one, and I'm not sure I understand this, so I may have to unpack this question a little bit more with this person. So once you assess the behaviors needing to be trained, how do you do that? I'll take it, and then if it doesn't make sense, ask the follow on. I think what we're talking about, if we kind of tie it back up, is that as you are thinking about designing your leadership strategy, you really need to value the inner game, which is, to Pamela's point, that self-awareness, being true to who you are, understanding your blind spots, the inner game, along with the external forces at play. And so our recommendation is to use preferably a predictive assessment like a Harrison, but to use your HR metrics, another way of saying it, differently to assess what needs to be trained. Because to make the assumption that everybody is the same and kind of, have this cookie cutter approach to it doesn't work, particularly in today's uncertain business environment. So the more you can have a leadership development that's targeted to a Pamela, to a Tracey, the better. Pamela, would you add to that? Anything you might add to that?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I just would increase the importance on organizational analytics on the people side. We got pretty darn excited to be able to provide organizational analytics to make those decisions well, because part of the resistance to the training is that, oh no, here I go again. I'm one of an X number of people being treated as if I'm the same, and I'm not.
Great point. I'm going to keep going because I know Mackenzie's she's going to cut me off here, but we got a bunch of questions. Here's another one. What methods of introduction do you suggest when exposing upper management to the value of these ideas in industries where many of the traits and behaviors are normalized? I'll take that. And then Pamela, you're first of all, what I would say, okay, I'm going to just shout out Pamela, is take Pamela with you to the meeting. Okay. So my secret weapon would be to take Pamela to your management meeting. So I've been on a number of meetings with Pamela across, like big companies that you've all, like cars we drive and healthcare that we use and credit cards and all this other stuff. The woman is just everywhere. And so if you get her talking to upper management about these behaviors, that's a really good thing. So what I would say is that there's ways we could help you make the case about this, what we call this big idea. That's part of why we wanted to do this. And even in industries where traits and characteristics, behaviors are normalized, meaning that that's kind of the way it is, this concept of the internal, external, the paradoxical leadership still applies. You're not immune. Pamela, what else would you say?
Yeah, I would say that the reason it's hard and the reason the question is being asked is because there's already and always a way of thinking about this as if the past should inform the future. And it can't. We're looking at something whose time has come, and we're looking at the effects of all of the not having decided from a paradoxical view. We're looking at the extremism that comes from thinking that whatever you think is the truth and not being interested. One of the things I tell my emerging leader accelerator participants is bring your curiosity, bring your questions. They're far more valuable than your answers, but those who have had success in good times think that they own that success, and that is often not the case. And that's a hard position to try to take on when you're in HR, right? There's not a history of respect there necessarily, so you do have a big climb. I agree with Tracey. Take me with you.
I think we have time for one more, but Mackenzie may cut me off. Let me get this in. This is for you, Pamela, because again, how do you train on soft skill behavior?
Well, you start by assessing them. All right. I mean, that's an easy ball. Thank you for that one, right? Because if you know what the paradoxical imbalances are, and then you put that team together, that's how Tracey and I met. I was doing team building with the paradoxes in a Chicago company, and then we were able to meet and have dinner together. Is you just have to show them. You have to show them for themselves first. Here are your imbalances, and here are your balances, and here's who you are. It's a demonstration, and then they go, "Oh, you got me."
Okay, I think we can keep going, but I think the metaphorical hook is for both you and I. So like I said, our bios are in the back, our contact information, link in with us. You can tell how much we love this topic and want to help you as much as we can. Mackenzie, do I have any more questions, or you going to call it a wrap?
No, you have time. There's a break between now and the next session. So there's
there is. Okay. How has the global pandemic impacted these trends?
Well, yeah. So if anybody doesn't understand how the invisible can have global impacts, they've been sequestered somewhere, right? You can't taste, see, or smell COVID-19, but you can certainly experience it. And that is also true of leadership. It's intangible. I'm going to take a minute to get on my soapbox to say that my stand is that leaders lead with integrity, with love, and listen for people's greatness. And when you look at the measures, that's not happening out there. We're not being trusted. Leadership is not being trusted. Real leaders foster trust. So, the global pandemic should have every leader questioning every source of information, because it's too easy to go with the majority or the popularity, right? Or believe global or national leaders are leading us where we want to go. I think we've gotten numbed into some kind of oblivious, and we're not thinking well. And I used to be an educator. I don't want to go there, but it's not so obvious with the deterioration of social media reliability. More strategic judgment is needed today to learn what's truth, and what truth do you want to be known for, right? It takes courage. So you feel the fear and do it anyway when you know what's right. And what's right isn't taking an extreme position. It's asking good questions.
Okay, well, you're getting some shout out from the chat on that one. Okay, so
I could roll down and show that we actually do have our information that we promised. There's Tracey, the one and only. And there I am. Yeah. So thank you for your listening.
Yep, thank you so much. And you'll have this, and again, reach out to us, and we would be happy to help you in any way we can.
Okay, so this concludes our webcast for today. I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us.